Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through time where we gently unfold the extraordinary story of one woman who transformed an empire. Tonight we'll walk alongside Catherine the Great as she navigates the glittering halls of the Russian court, reshapes a nation, and creates what history remembers as Russia's Golden Age. Whether you're settling in for the evening or simply seeking a moment of tranquil storytelling, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with us. Picture yourself in the year 1744, standing in the grand corridors of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The marble floors gleam beneath crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with silk tapestries. This is where our story begins. Not with the Empress Catherine would become, but with a 15-year-old German princess named Sophie Friedrich August, who had just arrived in this foreign land with nothing but ambition burning in her heart. Sophie's daily routine in those early months was carefully orchestrated by the Russian court. Each morning she would wake in chambers that seemed impossibly vast compared to her modest quarters back in Prussia. Her ladies-in-waiting would dress her in the elaborate Russian court dress, layer upon layer of silk and brocade that felt foreign against her skin. The weight of the fabric was nothing compared to the weight of expectation that pressed upon her young shoulders. After breaking her fast with weak tea and black bread, Sophie would spend hours in language lessons with her Russian tutor. The Cyrillic letters seemed to dance mockingly on the page before her, but she attacked each lesson with the determination that would later reshape an empire. She understood that language was power, that to truly rule the Russian people, she must first speak to them in their own tongue. Her German accent slowly gave way to the flowing cadences of Russian, though traces of her Prussian origins would linger in her speech for years to come. The afternoons brought dancing lessons in the palace's grand ballroom. Here, Sophie learned the intricate steps of Russian court dances, her feet moving across polished floors while musicians played haunting melodies that seemed to echo the vast steps beyond the palace walls. These weren't merely social graces she was acquiring, but the subtle art of court politics. Every curtsy, every graceful turn, every carefully placed smile was a move in the complex chess game of Russian nobility. But it was during the quiet evening hours that Sophie truly came alive. While other members of the court retired to their chambers for gossip and cards, she would slip away to the palace library. Here, surrounded by leather-bound volumes that chronicled the wisdom of ages, she devoured works by Voltaire, Montesquieu, and other Enlightenment philosophers. The ideas contained within these pages would later bloom into the progressive reforms that would define her reign. She read by candlelight until her eyes grew heavy, her mind buzzing with concepts of justice, governance, and the rights of people. Sleep came fitfully for Sophie in those early years. The Russian winters were harsher than anything she had known in Prussia, and the palace, for all its grandeur, was drafty and cold. She would lie beneath heavy firs listening to the wind howl across the frozen Neva River and wonder if she would ever truly belong in this strange land. Little did she know that Russia would not merely accept her, but that she would become its greatest ruler. The transformation from Sophie to Catherine began gradually, almost imperceptibly. First came her conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, a political necessity that required her to renounce the Lutheran faith of her childhood. The ceremony took place in a small chapel within the palace. its walls covered in golden icons that seemed to watch her every move. As holy water touched her forehead and the priest intoned ancient prayers in Old Church Slavonic, Sophie felt something shift within her. She was no longer merely a German princess seeking advantageous marriage. She was becoming Russian. Her betrothal to Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was announced with great fanfare. Cannons boomed across St. Petersburg as the city celebrated. But for Catherine, now called Catherine, the engagement felt more like a chess move than a romantic union. Peter was a weak, petulant young man who preferred playing with toy soldiers to learning the art of governance. Their conversations were stilted affairs, filled with long silences and uncomfortable attempts at pleasantry. Catherine's daily routine shifted dramatically after the engagement. Her mornings now began with briefings from court officials who sought to prepare her for her future role as Empress. She learned about Russia's complex relationship with its European neighbors, the ongoing struggles with the Ottoman Empire, and the delicate balance between the nobility and the common people. These lessons fascinated her far more than her upcoming wedding preparations. The wedding itself, held in the Cathedral of the Assumption in Moscow, was a spectacle that dazzled even the jaded Russian nobility. Catherine wore a gown of silver tissue embroidered with diamonds, so heavy she could barely walk. The ceremony lasted for hours, conducted in the ancient traditions of the Orthodox Church, while thousands of spectators filled the cathedral and spilled out into Red Square. As she spoke her vows, Catherine felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders. Married life with Peter proved even more challenging than the engagement had suggested. Their apartments in the palace were separate, connected only by a long corridor that Catherine would traverse each evening for formal dinners with her husband. Peter would regale her with detailed accounts of his military exercises, complete with maps and toy soldiers arranged on the dining table. His obsession with all things Prussian grated against Catherine's growing love for her adopted homeland. During these early years of marriage, Catherine developed the habits that would serve her throughout her reign. She rose before dawn, using the quiet morning hours to read and write. Her correspondence grew extensive during this period as she cultivated relationships with intellectuals across Europe. Letters would be carefully placed on envelopes with beeswax, sealed with the imperial crest, and sent out into the vast network of envoys and messengers that ran across Europe. She used her charm and intellect to build bridges with intellectuals and politicians alike, laying the groundwork for the future reforms that she would bring to Russia.
Arrived from Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, bringing news of the latest philosophical developments and political intrigues. Catherine would spend hours crafting careful responses, her quill scratching across parchment as she built the network of connections that would later support her reforms. The imperial court was a maze of competing interests and hidden agendas, and Catherine learned to navigate it with increasing skill. She attended every social function, every diplomatic reception, every ceremony that her position required. But she also listened carefully to the conversations swirling around her, filing away information about which nobles were loyal to the crown, which harbored secret grievances, and which might prove useful allies in future endeavors. Her relationship with Empress Elizabeth, Peter's aunt, and the reigning monarch was particularly complex. Elizabeth was a formidable woman who had seized the throne through a palace coup decades earlier. She watched Catherine with a mixture of approval and suspicion, recognizing the young woman's intelligence while wondering if that same intelligence might one day pose a threat. Their conversations were elaborate dances of courtesy and subtle probing, each woman trying to understand the other's true intentions. Catherine's daily walks through the palace gardens became a form of meditation. During this period, she would stroll among the carefully manicured hedges and ornate fountains, her mind processing the day's lessons and encounters. The gardens were designed in the French style, with geometric precision that reflected the ordered world the Russian nobility sought to create. But beyond the formal gardens lay the vast Russian wilderness, and Catherine found herself drawn to those untamed spaces that seemed to embody the true spirit of her adopted homeland. Evening entertainments at court were elaborate affairs that could last until dawn. Catherine learned to excel at these gatherings, charming foreign diplomats with her wit and intelligence, while carefully observing the complex web of relationships that bound the Russian nobility together. She discovered that many of the courtiers harbored deep concerns about Peter's fitness to rule, concerns that grew more pronounced as his erratic behavior became increasingly difficult to ignore. The birth of her son Paul in 1754 marked another transformation in Catherine's daily life. Empress Elizabeth immediately claimed the infant as her own, whisking him away to be raised according to her specifications. Catherine was permitted to see her child only at designated times, always under the watchful eyes of the Empress's chosen nurses and tutors. This separation was agonizing for Catherine, but it also freed her to focus more intently on her political education. Her study of Russian history became more intensive during this period. Catherine would spend entire afternoons poring over chronicles that told the story of her adopted nation, from the earlier Slavic tribes through the rise of Moscow and the establishment of the Romanov dynasty. She began to understand the deep currents that had shaped Russian culture and politics, knowledge that would prove invaluable in the years to come. The death of Empress Elizabeth in 1761 changed everything. Peter ascended to the throne as Peter III, and Catherine became Empress consort. But Peter's brief reign was marked by a series of disastrous decisions that alienated virtually every important constituency in Russian society. He ended Russia's successful war against Prussia just as victory seemed within reach, insulted the Orthodox Church by attempting to impose Lutheran practices, and openly spoke of his plans to restructure the Russian military along Prussian lines. Catherine watched these developments with growing alarm and opportunity. She had spent nearly 2 decades preparing for this moment, building relationships, studying governance, and understanding the needs of the Russian people. Now, as Peter's reign crumbled around him, those years of preparation would finally bear fruit in ways that would transform not just her own life, but the destiny of an entire empire. The palace corridors buzzed with whispered conversations. As nobles gathered in small clusters, their voices barely audible above the soft shuffle of silk slippers on marble floors. Catherine moved through these gatherings like a careful observer, her face maintaining the serene expression expected of an empress, while her mind catalogued every gesture, every meaningful glance, every carefully chosen word that hinted at the growing dissatisfaction with Peter's rule. Her mornings now began in the map room, where military advisors would spread vast charts across oak tables, their fingers tracing the borders of an empire that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Catherine would lean over these maps, absorbing the geography of her realm while listening to reports of grain harvests in Ukraine, fur trading expeditions in Siberia, and diplomatic tensions along the Turkish frontier. The sheer scale of Russia began to impress itself upon her consciousness during these sessions. Each afternoon brought audiences with petitioners from across the empire. Merchants from Novgorod would kneel before her throne, requesting tax relief after poor harvests. Military officers would present detailed reports of skirmishes along distant frontiers. Provincial governors would seek guidance on everything from road construction to religious disputes. Catherine listened to each supplicant with careful attention, filing away information about the real conditions faced by ordinary Russians far from the glittering halls of St. Petersburg. The Imperial Library became her sanctuary during the tense months of Peter's reign. Here, surrounded by volumes that chronicled the rise and fall of empires throughout history, Catherine would spend hours studying the art of governance. She read Caesar's commentaries on his campaigns in Gaul, absorbed Machiavelli's insights into the nature of political power, and pondered Marcus Aurelius's reflections on leadership and duty. These ancient voices seemed to speak directly to her situation, offering wisdom that transcended the centuries. Her correspondence during this period revealed the depth of her political thinking.
Letters flowed from her private study to intellectuals across Europe, each one carefully crafted to advance her understanding of Enlightenment principles while building networks of support for the reforms she hoped to implement. Voltaire himself became a regular correspondent, their exchanges revealing a meeting of minds that transcended the traditional boundaries between philosophers and rulers. The growing crisis of Peter's reign created opportunities for Catherine to demonstrate her superior grasp of statecraft. When Peter announced his intention to declare war on Denmark to reclaim territories for his beloved Holstein, Catherine quietly met with military commanders to discuss the folly of such an enterprise. Russia's armies were already stretched thin across multiple frontiers, and a new war would bankrupt the treasury while serving no Russian interest. Her ability to articulate these concerns in language that resonated with practical soldiers helped solidify their respect for her judgment. Evening gatherings in the palace ballroom took on an increasingly charged atmosphere as Peter's reign progressed. The Grand Duke would hold court from his throne, regaling assembled nobles with detailed accounts of his latest military reforms, most of which involved replacing time-honored Russian traditions with Prussian innovations. Catherine would sit beside him, maintaining the appearance of dutiful support, while her eyes met those of nobles whose expressions revealed their growing alarm at their emperor's pronouncements. The Orthodox Church provided another avenue for Catherine to demonstrate her understanding of Russian values. While Peter spoke openly of his disdain for Orthodox traditions and his preference for Lutheran practices, Catherine made a point of attending every major religious ceremony with obvious devotion. She would kneel for hours during lengthy liturgies, her lips moving in prayer as golden incense swirled around icons that had watched over Russian rulers for centuries. These displays of piety were more than mere political theater. They reflected her genuine appreciation for the spiritual traditions that bound the Russian people together. Her personal apartments became informal centers of political discussion, as concerned nobles sought private audiences to express their fears about the empire's direction. Catherine would receive these visitors in her private sitting room, a more intimate space decorated with portraits of previous Russian rulers and maps of the territories they had conquered. The conversations that took place in this room were carefully orchestrated dances of implication and suggestion, with no one daring to speak openly of the possibility that might soon reshape the empire's destiny. The summer of 1762 brought a series of events that would test every skill Catherine had developed during her years of preparation. Peter's decision to withdraw Russian forces from the successful campaign against Prussia sent shockwaves through the military hierarchy. Officers who had spent years fighting to expand Russian influence in Europe suddenly found their sacrifices rendered meaningless by an emperor who seemed more concerned with pleasing the Prussian king than serving Russian interests. The disgust in their voices was barely concealed when they reported to Catherine about the emperor's latest pronouncements. Catherine's daily routine during these critical weeks became a careful balance of public duty and private preparation. She would appear at court functions with her usual grace, participating in ceremonies and entertainments, while maintaining the facade of marital harmony with Peter. But her private hours were consumed with meetings, correspondence, and planning sessions that laid the groundwork for what many were beginning to see as an inevitable confrontation. The imperial stables provided an unexpected venue for some of these crucial conversations. Catherine had always been an accomplished horsewoman, and her daily rides through the palace grounds offered opportunities for private discussions, away from the listening ears that filled every corridor of the Winter Palace. Military officers would join her for these rides, their horses walking side by side through wooded paths while they discussed matters too sensitive for indoor conversations. Her relationship with Gregory Orlov, a charismatic guards officer who had become her lover, added another layer to the political situation. Orlov commanded the loyalty of his fellow officers in the elite guards regiments that protected the imperial family. Through him, Catherine gained access to the military networks that would prove crucial in the coming crisis. Their romance was conducted with the utmost discretion, but it provided Catherine with invaluable intelligence about the mood and intentions of the armed forces that ultimately held the key to political power in Russia. The birth of her son, Alex, in April 1762, created additional urgency around the political situation. Though the child's parentage was officially attributed to Peter, court gossip suggested otherwise, and Catherine understood that her position would become increasingly precarious if Peter chose to challenge the succession. The infant became another factor in the complex calculations that were reshaping the political landscape of the empire. Late-night meetings in Catherine's private chambers brought together a carefully selected group of nobles, military officers, and court officials who shared concerns about the empire's future under Peter's continued rule. These gatherings were masterpieces of careful conspiracy, with each participant understanding their role while maintaining plausible deniability about the ultimate objectives being discussed. Catherine presided over these sessions with the skill of a seasoned diplomat, guiding conversations toward inevitable conclusions while allowing others to voice the sentiments she could not openly express. The final weeks of Peter's reign unfolded with the inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy. His decision to move against the Orthodox Church by seizing monastic lands turned religious leaders against him. His plan to restructure the military along Prussian lines turned military leaders against him.
Lines alienated the officer corps. His obvious preference for Prussian interests over Russian ones disgusted the nobility. Each of these decisions narrowed his base of support while expanding the coalition of forces that looked to Catherine as an alternative. On the morning of June 28, 1762, as dawn broke over the spires of St. Petersburg, Catherine would finally step forward to claim the destiny that 18 years of careful preparation had made possible. The revolution began not with the clash of swords or the thunder of cannons, but with the gentle rustle of silk as Catherine rose from her bed in the pre-dawn darkness of that fateful summer morning. Her chambers were still draped in shadows when she heard the soft knock that would change the course of Russian history. Alexei Orlov stood in her doorway, his face grave with the weight of news that could not wait for a more civilized hour. Peter had signed an order for Catherine's arrest. The conspiracy they had so carefully nurtured over months of whispered conversations and midnight meetings was no longer a matter of future possibility. It had become an immediate necessity for survival. Catherine's morning routine transformed in that instant from the measured pace of imperial ceremony to the urgent choreography of revolution. Her ladies-in-waiting helped her dress not in the elaborate court gown she typically wore, but in a simple traveling dress that would allow for rapid movement. The heavy jewels that usually adorned her throat and wrists were replaced by a single strand of pearls, chosen for their symbolic value rather than their monetary worth. Every decision carried significance in these crucial hours. As her carriage rolled through the sleeping streets of St. Petersburg toward the Ismailevsky Regiment barracks, Catherine gazed through the windows at a city that seemed suspended between two worlds. The grand palaces and government buildings that lined the Nevsky Prospect represented the old order, the system of autocratic rule that had governed Russia for centuries. But in the growing light of dawn, she could see the stirrings of ordinary citizens beginning their daily routines, unaware that their empire was about to be transformed by the quiet determination of a woman they knew only as the German princess who had married their unpopular emperor. The soldiers of the Ismailevsky regiment had been waiting for her arrival since before sunrise. These were not the pampered courtiers of the Winter Palace, but hardened veterans who had fought in campaigns across Europe and understood the practical realities of power better than any philosopher or diplomat. When Catherine stepped from her carriage and walked among their ranks,
She saw in their eyes a mixture of respect and anticipation that told her everything she needed to know about the success of their months of careful preparation. Her speech to the assembled troops was brief but electrifying. Standing on a wooden platform hastily constructed in the regiment's courtyard, Catherine spoke in fluent Russian about her love for their homeland and her determination to restore the honor and glory that Peter's reign had squandered. Her voice carried across the morning air with a clarity that seemed to penetrate not just the ears, but the hearts of every man present. When she finished speaking, the cheers that erupted from hundreds of throats echoed off the surrounding buildings like thunder. The march to the Winter Palace became a triumphant procession as word of Catherine's revolution spread through the city. Citizens poured from their homes to line the streets, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, excitement, and hope that had been absent from St. Petersburg for months. Merchants closed their shops to join the growing crowd. Servants abandoned their morning duties to witness history in the making. Even members of the nobility who had remained cautiously neutral during the conspiracy now appeared at their palace windows, nodding their approval as Catherine's carriage passed beneath them. Inside the Winter Palace, Catherine found herself standing in the same grand reception hall where she had first been presented to Empress Elizabeth nearly 2 decades earlier. But now she was no longer the uncertain teenage princess seeking acceptance in a foreign court. She had become the undisputed ruler of the largest empire on earth, her authority confirmed not by hereditary right, but by the collective will of the Russian people and their armed forces. The bureaucracy of revolution required immediate attention to countless details that would transform military coup into legitimate government. Catherine's afternoon was consumed with meetings in the palace's administrative chambers, where clerks and secretaries worked frantically to draft the proclamations, decrees, and official documents that would formalize her assumption of power. Each signature she affixed to these papers represented another step in the irreversible transformation from Catherine the conspirator to Catherine the Empress. Her first imperial decree abolished Peter's most unpopular policies with elegant simplicity. The planned war against Denmark was cancelled. The seizure of church lands was reversed. The reorganization of the military along Prussian lines was abandoned. Each announcement was greeted with visible relief by the assembled officials who had watched Peter's reign with growing alarm. Catherine understood that successful revolutions required not just the seizure of power, but its immediate and visible exercise in ways that addressed the concerns that had made revolution necessary. The evening brought the delicate task of managing Peter's fate. The deposed emperor had been captured without resistance at his palace outside the city, his dreams of military glory collapsing as quickly as his political authority. Catherine met with him in a small chamber of the Winter Palace, their conversation conducted with the formal courtesy that both their positions and their shared history demanded. Peter's abdication document was signed with a trembling hand, his signature marking the end of one of the shortest and most disastrous reigns in Russian history.
St. Petersburg. Catherine stood alone in the imperial study that had once belonged to Elizabeth, surrounded by the maps, documents, and artifacts of Russian power. The room seemed to pulse with the accumulated authority of centuries, and she could feel the weight of responsibilities settling upon her shoulders like an invisible crown. Through the tall windows she could see the lights of the city stretching toward the horizon, each one representing a life that would be affected by the decisions she would make in the years to come. Her first night as sole ruler of Russia was spent not in celebration, but in preparation for the enormous tasks that lay ahead. Catherine worked through the early hours of morning, reading reports from provincial governors, reviewing military dispatches from distant frontiers, and studying the financial records that revealed the true state of the imperial treasury. Each document painted a picture of an empire rich in potential, but burdened by inefficiency, corruption, and the accumulated neglect of previous reigns. The daily routine that Catherine established in her first few weeks as Empress would define the character of her reign for the next 34 years. She rose before dawn, using the quiet morning hours to read and respond to correspondence from across the empire. Breakfast was a simple affair, taken in her private chambers while reviewing the day's schedule with her secretary. The elaborate court ceremonies that had consumed so much time during Elizabeth's reign were streamlined to allow for more substantive work on the business of governing. Her morning audiences became legendary for their efficiency and accessibility. Catherine would receive petitioners from across the social spectrum, listening to complaints from peasants with the same attention she gave to the concerns of wealthy merchants or provincial nobles. These sessions provided her with invaluable intelligence about conditions throughout the empire, while demonstrating her commitment to ruling for all Russians rather than just the privileged elite who had traditionally dominated court politics. The imperial council meetings that followed these audiences were transformed from ceremonial gatherings into working sessions where real policy decisions were made. Catherine would preside from behind a massive oak table covered with maps and documents, her questions probing and specific rather than the generalized inquiries that had characterized previous rulers' approach to governance. Ministers who had grown accustomed to offering vague reassurances found themselves required to provide detailed reports backed by concrete evidence. Afternoons were devoted to the detailed work of administration that Catherine had discovered was essential for effective rule. She would review proposed legislation line by line, making marginal notes and asking pointed questions about implementation and enforcement. Provincial reports received similar scrutiny, with Catherine maintaining detailed mental maps of conditions across her vast territories. Her knowledge of local circumstances often surprised visiting governors who had assumed that the Empress in distant St. Petersburg could not possibly understand the complexities of their particular regions. The palace library remained Catherine's refuge during these intense early months of her reign. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, she would spend evening hours studying the works of political theorists and examining historical precedents for the reforms she hoped to implement. The margins of her books filled with notes as she developed the intellectual framework that would guide her transformation of Russian society. Her correspondence during this period revealed the scope of her ambitions and the methodical approach she brought to their realization. Letters flowed from her private study to scholars across Europe, seeking advice on everything from legal codes to agricultural techniques. She wrote to Voltaire about the principles of enlightened governance, to French economists about trade policies, and to German philosophers about educational reform. Each exchange contributed to the comprehensive vision of modernization that would define her reign. The social calendar of the imperial court was restructured to serve Catherine's political objectives rather than merely providing entertainment for the nobility. Evening receptions became opportunities for Catherine to gauge opinion on proposed reforms while building consensus among influential figures whose support would be essential for successful implementation. These gatherings combined the traditional elegance of Russian court life with substantive discussions of policy that elevated the intellectual tone of palace society. Catherine's personal habits during this period reflected her understanding that effective leadership required both physical and mental discipline. She maintained a strict daily schedule that balanced the demands of governance with the exercise and intellectual stimulation necessary to sustain the energy required for ruling a vast empire. Her morning horseback rides through the palace grounds provided both physical fitness and opportunities for private conversations with key advisors, away from the formal constraints of official meetings. The challenge of establishing her legitimacy as Empress required Catherine to navigate carefully between innovation and tradition. Her public appearances were choreographed to demonstrate both her respect for Russian customs and her commitment to necessary reforms. She would attend Orthodox services with obvious devotion, while privately meeting with foreign advisors about European political developments. Her wardrobe combined traditional Russian elements with contemporary European fashion, symbolically representing her role as a bridge between old and new approaches to governance. Winter brought the first major test of Catherine's new government, as harvest failures in several provinces threatened widespread famine. Her response revealed both her grasp of administrative detail and her understanding of the political dimensions of effective crisis management. Emergency grain supplies were mobilized from surplus regions and transported across vast distances to areas of greatest need. Local officials who proved incompetent or corrupt in managing relief efforts were replaced with administrators chosen for their competence rather than their connections.
The success of these relief efforts established Catherine's reputation as a ruler who could deliver practical results rather than merely impressive proclamations. Provincial reports during the following spring documented not just the prevention of famine, but improvements in agricultural techniques and storage methods that would reduce the likelihood of future crises. These achievements provided concrete evidence of the benefits of Catherine's more systematic approach to governance. As her second year of rule began, Catherine felt confident enough to announce the ambitious project that would become the centerpiece of her domestic policy. She would convene a great legislative commission to draft a new legal code for Russia, one based on Enlightenment principles of justice and equality, rather than the arbitrary traditions that had governed Russian law for centuries. The announcement sent ripples of excitement and apprehension throughout the empire, as nobles and commoners alike contemplated the implications of such a fundamental transformation of their legal system. The preparation for this legislative commission would consume much of Catherine's attention over the following months, as she worked to balance competing interests while maintaining momentum toward meaningful reform. The preparation for this monumental legislative commission became Catherine's consuming passion throughout 1766. Her daily routine shifted to accommodate the enormous scope of this undertaking. She would wake each morning in her private chambers and immediately turn to the growing collection of legal texts that covered every surface of her study. Blackstone's commentaries on English law sat beside the Carius treatise on crimes and punishments, while Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws lay open with pages marked by ribbons in multiple colors. Her breakfast table became a working surface where she would spread drafts of her instruction to the Legislative Commission while sipping weak tea and nibbling at black bread. The document that emerged from these morning sessions would eventually span over 500 articles, each one carefully crafted to reflect Enlightenment principles while remaining practical enough for implementation across the vast expanse of Russia. Catherine's pen moved steadily across page after page, her handwriting becoming smaller and more cramped as her excitement grew with each completed section. The selection of delegates to the commission required Catherine to demonstrate her understanding of Russian society's complex structure. Representatives would come not just from the traditional nobility and clergy, but from merchants, Cossacks, state peasants, and even some categories of serfs. Her afternoons were spent reviewing lists of potential delegates, studying their backgrounds and qualifications with the same attention she had once devoted to court genealogies. Each choice carried political significance, as the composition of the commission would determine whether her reforms could gain acceptance across Russian society. Provincial responses to the call for delegates revealed the depth of interest in legal reform throughout the empire. Letters arrived daily at the Winter Palace from distant territories, their wax seals bearing the marks of communities that had never before been invited to participate in imperial governance. Catherine would read these communications in her evening hours, often by candlelight that cast dancing shadows across the pages. The requests, complaints, and suggestions contained in these letters provided her with invaluable insights into the real conditions faced by ordinary Russians far from the capital. The commission's opening ceremony in Moscow's Granovitaya Palata marked a revolutionary moment in Russian history.
Catherine had chosen the ancient hall deliberately, understanding that the setting would connect her reforms to Russia's deepest traditions while transforming their meaning for a new age. As delegates filed into the chamber, their diverse clothing reflected the breadth of Russian society. Silk-clad nobles took their seats beside merchants in fine wool coats, while Cossack representatives in traditional dress mingled with clerics in black robes. Catherine's opening address to the commission lasted nearly 3 hours, her voice carrying clearly through the vaulted chamber as she outlined her vision for a reformed legal system. She spoke of equality before the law, of punishments that fit crimes rather than the social status of criminals, and of courts that would dispense justice based on evidence rather than influence. The delegates listened in rapt attention, many hearing for the first time in their lives a Russian ruler speak of them as partners in governance rather than subjects to be commanded. Daily sessions that followed revealed both the promise and the challenges of Catherine's democratic experiment. Merchants from Arhangelsk would rise to describe the difficulties of conducting trade under unclear regulations, while noble representatives defended traditional privileges that had governed Russian society for centuries. Catherine attended as many sessions as her other duties permitted, sitting quietly in a special box while delegates debated issues that would reshape their empire. Her notebook filled with observations about the arguments presented and the personalities of key speakers. Evening receptions during the Commission's months of meetings became intense political gatherings where Catherine would gauge delegates' reactions to proposed reforms. She moved through these events with practiced grace, stopping to chat with merchants about trade regulations one moment and discussing judicial procedures with legal scholars the next. Her ability to remember personal details about delegates from across the empire impressed even her critics, as she would inquire about specific local conditions or family circumstances that demonstrated her genuine interest in their perspectives. The Commission's work extended far beyond legal technicalities into fundamental questions about the nature of Russian society. Debates about serfdom revealed deep divisions among delegates, with some arguing for gradual emancipation while others defended the institution as essential to agricultural production. Catherine listened to these discussions with particular intensity, understanding that the resolution of this issue would define her legacy as either a truly reforming ruler or merely another autocrat offering cosmetic changes to preserve essential inequalities. Her private correspondence during this period revealed the emotional toll of trying to balance competing demands while maintaining momentum toward meaningful reform. Letters to Voltaire spoke of her frustration with delegates who seemed more interested in protecting narrow interests than advancing general welfare. Communications with provincial governors reflected her growing understanding of the practical obstacles to implementing theoretical reforms across such a diverse and vast territory. The summer months brought intensive work sessions as Catherine collaborated with commission committees to refine specific aspects of the proposed legal code. Her morning schedule expanded to include meetings with legal experts who would explain the implications of various proposals, while her afternoons were consumed with reviewing draft articles and suggesting modifications. The palace's map room became a legal workshop where she would spread proposed legislation across tables while examining how different provisions might affect various regions of the empire. Religious questions proved particularly delicate as the Commission grappled with the role of Orthodox Christianity in Russian law. Catherine's own conversion to Orthodoxy had been politically motivated, but her years of study had given her genuine appreciation for the spiritual traditions that bound her subjects together. She worked carefully with church representatives to develop legal frameworks that would protect religious freedom while maintaining Orthodoxy's special position in Russian society. These negotiations often extended into evening hours, as theological discussions merged with practical considerations about implementation. The autumn sessions brought increasing focus on economic issues, as merchant delegates pressed for reforms that would stimulate trade and manufacturing. Catherine found these discussions particularly engaging as they connected to her broader vision of modernizing Russian society. Her morning routine expanded to include meetings with foreign merchants and diplomats who could provide insights into successful commercial practices in other European countries.
The intelligence gathered from these conversations informed her contributions to commission debates about trade regulations and manufacturing privileges. Military reform emerged as another major theme as the Commission examined laws governing service obligations and military justice. Catherine's experience with the palace coup that brought her to power had taught her the crucial importance of maintaining army loyalty while ensuring that military service served national rather than personal interests. Her afternoon meetings with military representatives revealed the complex tensions between traditional concepts of noble service and the professional military standards that modern warfare demanded. The winter recess provided Catherine with opportunities to evaluate the Commission's progress while preparing for the next phase of deliberations. Her daily routine during these months included extensive reading of European legal texts as she sought models that might be adapted to Russian conditions. The palace library became her primary workplace as she compared different approaches to criminal justice, civil rights, and administrative procedures. Her marginal notes in these volumes would later influence some of the most progressive aspects of her proposed legal code. International observers watched the Commission's proceedings with intense interest, recognizing that Catherine's experiment in participatory lawmaking represented something unprecedented in European governance. Foreign diplomats sent detailed reports to their capitals describing sessions where peasant representatives debated with nobles as equals, while European intellectuals praised Catherine's instruction as the most advanced statement of Enlightenment principles ever attempted by a reigning monarch. This international attention reinforced Catherine's determination to see the project through despite growing domestic resistance. The Commission's second year brought increasingly sophisticated debates as delegates developed expertise in legal theory while maintaining focus on practical implementation. Catherine's morning briefings from Commission secretaries revealed the evolution of delegate thinking as initial positions gave way to more nuanced understandings of complex issues. Her pride in this intellectual development was evident in letters to foreign correspondents, where she described the transformation of merchants and minor nobles into skilled legal theorists capable of sophisticated argumentation. Provincial reactions to Commission deliberations provided Catherine with valuable feedback about public opinion on proposed reforms. Her evening hours were often spent reading reports from governors about local responses to various proposals, while her correspondence with regional administrators revealed growing support for legal reforms that would reduce corruption and increase predictability in governmental operations. These positive responses encouraged Catherine to pursue more ambitious reforms despite resistance from conservative elements within the Commission itself. The practical challenges of implementing comprehensive legal reform became increasingly apparent as the Commission's work progressed. Catherine's morning meetings with administrative officials revealed the enormous difficulties involved in training judges, establishing new court procedures, and ensuring consistent application of reformed laws across the empire's vast territories. Her afternoon sessions with regional representatives focused on developing practical timelines and resource requirements for successful implementation. Trade delegations from European countries began arriving in St. Petersburg as news of Russia's legal reforms spread throughout the continent.
Receptions during this period combined social entertainment with serious discussions about commercial law and international trade agreements. Her ability to discuss complex legal concepts with foreign merchants while maintaining the gracious hospitality expected of an empress impressed visitors who had expected to find a less intellectually sophisticated court. The Commission's third year brought focus to the most controversial aspects of legal reform, as delegates finally addressed questions about serfdom and noble privileges that had been postponed during earlier sessions. Catherine's personal involvement in these debates intensified as she recognized that the success or failure of her entire reform program might depend on finding acceptable compromises on these fundamental issues. Her daily preparation for these sessions included extensive consultation with advisors who could help her navigate between competing demands while maintaining progress toward meaningful change. Agricultural reform discussions revealed deep connections between legal questions and economic development.
As delegates examined how changes in labor law might affect food production and rural prosperity, Catherine's morning routine expanded to include meetings with agricultural experts who could explain the relationship between different farming systems and various forms of labor organization. These technical discussions informed her contributions to commission debates about gradual versus immediate changes to existing rural relationships. The international situation added urgency to domestic reform efforts as tensions with the Ottoman Empire threatened to erupt into open warfare. Catherine understood that military success would depend partly on domestic stability, which in turn required resolution of the legal and social questions being debated by her commission. Her afternoon military briefings began, including assessments of how proposed reforms might affect army recruitment and provincial loyalty during wartime conditions. As spring arrived in 1768, Catherine could see that her great legislative experiment was approaching a crucial decision point, where theoretical discussions would need to give way to practical implementation or risk losing momentum entirely. The gathering storm clouds over the Black Sea seemed to mirror the tension building within the Commission's chambers. As delegates wrestled with questions that would reshape Russian society, Catherine could feel the weight of decision pressing upon every conversation, every vote, every carefully worded compromise that emerged from their deliberations. The spring of 1768 brought news that would test everything she had built during these years of patient reform. Ottoman forces were massing along the southern frontier, their movements tracked by Russian scouts who rode through the night to deliver urgent dispatches to the Winter Palace. Catherine would receive these reports in her private study each morning, unfolding leather pouches that contained maps marked with enemy positions and estimates of their strength. The parchment crackled between her fingers as she absorbed intelligence that confirmed what her diplomatic sources had been suggesting for months. War was inevitable. Her morning routine shifted to accommodate the dual demands of domestic reform and military preparation. After reviewing commission reports and approving new legal articles, Catherine would move to the war room, where her generals spread campaign maps across oak tables that groaned under the weight of military planning. The contrast was stark and telling. On one table lay documents that promised equality and justice for all Russians, while nearby sat battle plans that would send thousands of those same Russians to fight and die along distant rivers whose names most had never heard. The commission delegates sensed the changing atmosphere as palace corridors filled with uniformed officers and diplomatic couriers arriving at all hours. Their debates took on new urgency as they realized their window for peaceful reform might be closing. Catherine attended these sessions with heightened intensity, her questions more pointed and her interventions more frequent as she sought to preserve the momentum of legal reform even as military necessity demanded increasing attention. Her afternoon meetings with military commanders revealed the complex relationship between domestic policy and foreign war. Generals who had initially supported her legal reforms now argued that wartime demanded traditional approaches to military recruitment and provincial administration. Catherine listened to these concerns while maintaining her commitment to reform principles, understanding that her response to this crisis would define not just the current conflict, but the future character of her reign. Evening dispatches from the frontier brought increasingly dire news as Ottoman armies crossed into Russian territory and began their advance toward key fortress cities. Catherine would read these reports in her candlelit study, her finger tracing enemy movements on maps while calculating the time required to mobilize Russian forces. The mathematics of war were unforgiving, and she understood that every day spent in legislative deliberation was a day lost to military preparation. The decision to suspend the commission's work came after a sleepless night spent weighing competing demands that seemed impossible to reconcile. Catherine's announcement to the assembled delegates was brief and emotional, her voice carrying across the chamber as she explained that external threats required temporary postponement of their crucial work. Many delegates wept openly as they realized their unprecedented experiment in participatory governance was ending just as it approached its most important decisions. Military mobilization transformed the daily
Rhythm of the Winter Palace, as Catherine threw herself into the role of wartime commander with the same intensity she had brought to legal reform. Her morning briefings now focused entirely on troop movements, supply lines, and strategic objectives that would determine Russia's survival as a great power. The maps that covered her study walls showed not proposed judicial districts, but theaters of military operation, where Russian and Ottoman forces would clash in battles that could reshape the balance of European power. Her correspondence during the war's opening months reflected the emotional toll of abandoning domestic reform for military necessity. Letters to Voltaire spoke of her frustration at being forced to choose between enlightenment and survival, while communications with provincial governors revealed her determination to resume reform efforts once external threats were eliminated. The war had interrupted her vision of gradual transformation, but it had not destroyed her commitment to eventual change. The first major engagement came at Khotin, where Russian forces under General Ramontsev faced a vastly superior Ottoman army in a battle that would test every aspect of Catherine's military preparations. She waited in St. Petersburg for news of the outcome, her days consumed with anxiety as courier after courier arrived with fragmentary reports of the fighting. When word finally came of Russian victory, the celebrations in the capital lasted for 3 days, as citizens recognized that their new Empress had proven herself capable of defending the empire her predecessor had nearly destroyed. Victory at Khotin opened new possibilities for Russian expansion that Catherine had scarcely dared imagine when the war began. Her morning meetings with military planners now focused on exploiting success rather than merely surviving defeat, as maps showing Ottoman positions gave way to charts marking potential conquests. The Black Sea, long dominated by Turkish naval power, suddenly seemed within reach of Russian ambitions that had been frustrated for centuries. Naval construction became a consuming passion, as Catherine recognized that control of the Black Sea required a fleet capable of challenging Ottoman supremacy in waters they had dominated since the fall of Constantinople. Her afternoon inspections of St. Petersburg's shipyards revealed the enormous industrial effort required to build warships capable of operating in southern waters, far from their Baltic bases. The sound of hammers and saws filled these visits as she watched craftsmen shaping timber into vessels that would carry Russian power into new theaters of operation. The siege of Azov provided Catherine with her first direct experience of military command, as she traveled south to observe the campaign that would secure Russia's gateway to the Black Sea. The journey took weeks, her carriage rolling across steppes that stretched endlessly toward horizons that seemed to recede before advancing wheels. At night, she would camp with her escort under stars that blazed with intensity unknown in the northern latitudes of St. Petersburg, feeling the vast scale of the empire she ruled pressing upon her consciousness. Her presence at the siege transformed what had been a routine military operation into a symbolic moment that defined her reign's character. Catherine would rise before dawn to observe artillery bombardments that slowly reduced Ottoman fortifications to rubble, while her afternoons were spent touring trenches where Russian soldiers prepared for final assaults. The soldiers' reaction to their Empress's appearance among them was electric, their cheers echoing across the battlefield as they recognized her personal commitment to their cause. The fall of Azov opened the Black Sea to Russian navigation for the first time in centuries, fulfilling dreams that had motivated Russian expansion since the earliest czars. Catherine's return journey to St. Petersburg was a triumph that lasted for months, as cities along her route competed to offer the most elaborate celebrations. Her carriage would enter town squares decorated with captured Turkish banners, while church bells rang and cannon fired salutes that could be heard for miles across the surrounding countryside. Winter brought opportunities to consolidate military gains while planning the next phase of expansion that would carry Russian forces deeper into Ottoman territory. Catherine's daily routine combined strategic planning with diplomatic initiatives designed to prevent other European powers from intervening on behalf of the declining Turkish Empire. Her morning meetings with foreign ambassadors required delicate balancing of reassurance and intimidation, as she sought to isolate the Ottomans while avoiding the coalition warfare that had destroyed previous Russian expansion efforts. The naval victory at Chesma Bay provided Catherine with the most spectacular triumph of her military career, as Admiral Orlov's fleet destroyed the main Ottoman naval force in a night battle that illuminated the Mediterranean with the flames of burning ships. News of this victory reached St. Petersburg through diplomatic channels before official military dispatches arrived, creating days of uncertainty followed by explosive celebration. When confirmation finally came, Catherine commissioned artists to create paintings commemorating the battle, while architects designed monuments that would remind future generations of Russian naval supremacy. Agricultural reports during the war's second year revealed the domestic costs of military success, as conscription removed farmers from their fields while taxation to support military operations strained rural communities. Catherine's afternoon meetings with provincial administrators focused on maintaining food production while meeting military recruitment demands that seemed to grow with each new campaign. The balance between military necessity and domestic stability required constant adjustment as she sought to sustain popular support for expensive foreign adventures. Treaty negotiations with the Ottomans began secretly during the winter of 1770, as both sides recognized that the war's continuation threatened to exhaust resources needed for domestic governance. Morning briefings now included diplomatic as well as military intelligence, as she evaluated Ottoman peace overtures while maintaining military pressure that would ensure favorable settlement terms. The art of negotiation from strength required careful calibration of military operations with diplomatic initiatives. The preliminary peace discussions revealed the scope of Russian gains that Catherine's military success had made possible. Her study walls now displayed maps showing potential new borders that would extend Russian territory hundreds of miles south, while securing access to warm water ports that had been Ottoman monopolies for centuries. Each proposed boundary line represented not just territorial acquisition, but strategic advantages that would reshape the balance of European power for generations. Spring campaigns in 1771 brought Russian forces to the gates of Constantinople itself, as Catherine's generals exploited Ottoman weakness with an aggressiveness that surprised European observers. Her morning reports described advances that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations, while her afternoon planning sessions focused on managing success that threatened to destabilize the entire eastern Mediterranean. The prospect of Russian forces entering the Ottoman capital raised diplomatic complications that required careful management to avoid European intervention. The final peace settlement at Kuchuk-Kinagi exceeded Catherine's original war aims while establishing principles that would guide Russian expansion for decades to come. Her signature on the treaty documents marked not just the end of a successful war, but the beginning of Russia's transformation into a truly European power, capable of projecting force across multiple theaters. The ceremony took place in a pavilion specially constructed for the occasion, its silk walls decorated with maps showing the new borders that Russian victories had secured. Victory celebrations in St. Petersburg lasted for weeks, as Catherine's subjects recognized that their Empress had achieved what previous rulers had only dreamed of attempting. Her appearances during these festivities revealed a confidence and authority that had been tested by war and proven equal to the challenges of great power competition. The shy German princess who had arrived in Russia 30 years earlier had been transformed by experience into an empress whose military success commanded respect throughout Europe. The war's conclusion provided Catherine with opportunities to return to the domestic reforms that had been interrupted by military necessity, but she now approached these questions with the enhanced authority that successful defense of the realm had provided. Her morning routine gradually shifted back toward legal and administrative matters as military briefings gave way to discussions of internal policy. The Commission's work could not be simply resumed, but the principles it had established would find new expression in the more confident reform efforts that would define the next phase of her reign.
The palace corridors that had buzzed with military planning for 4 years slowly returned to their peacetime rhythms as Catherine turned her attention toward the enormous tasks of governing an empire that had grown substantially during the Turkish War. Her afternoon meetings with newly appointed administrators in conquered territories revealed the challenges of integrating diverse populations while maintaining the religious and cultural tolerance that had become hallmarks of her domestic policy. These sessions often extended into evening hours as she worked to develop frameworks for governing Orthodox Russians, Muslim Tatars, and other ethnic groups whose cooperation would be essential for lasting peace. Her personal correspondence during this period reflected both satisfaction with military achievements and renewed excitement about domestic possibilities that victory had created. Letters to European intellectuals described plans for new cities in conquered territories, while communications with provincial governors outlined infrastructure projects that would connect new territories with existing Russian administrative systems. The scope of these undertakings revealed Catherine's understanding that military conquest was only the first step in the complex process of imperial expansion. Educational reform emerged as a crucial priority, as Catherine recognized that effective governance of her enlarged empire required administrators capable of managing diverse populations according to Enlightened principles. Her morning meetings with pedagogical experts focused on developing curricula that would prepare future civil servants, while her afternoon sessions with architectural consultants planned schools and universities that would serve as centers of learning throughout the expanded realm. The establishment of these institutions would take years, but Catherine understood that lasting reform required patient investment in human development. Religious policy required particularly delicate handling, as Catherine worked to maintain Orthodox Christianity's central role in Russian identity while accommodating the Muslim populations that had come under Russian rule through military conquest. Her evening meetings with church leaders and Islamic scholars produced frameworks for religious tolerance that would allow different faith communities to coexist peacefully while maintaining their distinct traditions. These discussions often continued long past midnight as theological differences merged with practical questions about legal systems and community governance. The founding of new cities in conquered territories provided Catherine with opportunities to implement urban planning principles that reflected Enlightenment ideals while meeting practical needs of diverse populations. Her morning inspections of architectural plans revealed ambitious designs for communities that would combine Russian governmental efficiency with accommodation for local customs and traditions. These planned cities would serve as centers of government and commerce, as well as symbols of Russian power in the recently incorporated regions. Laboratories for testing approaches to multi-ethnic governance that might eventually be applied throughout the empire. As 1774 drew to a close, Catherine could survey an empire transformed by 6 years of war and conquest. But she understood that the greatest challenges lay ahead as she worked to convert military success into lasting political and social transformation that would justify the enormous costs of expansion. The transformation of conquered territories into functioning parts of the Russian Empire became Catherine's greatest administrative challenge. As 1775 dawned cold and bright over St. Petersburg, her morning routine now began with reports from newly appointed governors who faced the delicate task of integrating Muslim Tatars, Orthodox Greeks, and various Slavic communities under a single administrative system. She would spread these dispatches across her mahogany desk while sipping her customary weak tea, her eyes scanning accounts of everything from tax collection difficulties to religious disputes that required imperial intervention. The palace map room had been reorganized to accommodate the empire's new southern territories, with detailed charts showing the Crimean Peninsula and Black Sea coastline, replacing the smaller-scale documents that had sufficed during peacetime. Catherine would spend her late morning hours studying these maps with provincial administrators, her finger tracing proposed road networks that would connect isolated communities to major trading centers. The engineering challenges were enormous, requiring bridges across rivers that froze solid in winter,
and causeways through marshlands that became impassable seas of mud during spring floods. Her afternoon audiences now included a bewildering variety of petitioners from across the expanded empire. Tatar merchants would arrive in traditional robes to request trading privileges, while Greek Orthodox priests sought protection for ancient monasteries that had survived centuries of Ottoman rule. Catherine listened to each supplicant through interpreters when necessary, her questions revealing her determination to understand local conditions rather than simply imposing Russian solutions on foreign problems. These sessions often lasted until evening, as complex cultural and religious issues required patient exploration rather than quick administrative fixes. The establishment of Kherson as a major southern port consumed enormous attention as Catherine recognized that Russia's Black Sea access would be meaningless without proper facilities for naval and commercial vessels. Her evening meetings with naval architects and city planners produced ambitious designs for harbor installations that could accommodate the largest ships while providing storage and administrative facilities for the expanded trade she envisioned. Construction reports arrived weekly from the building site, describing progress that seemed painfully slow given the magnitude of her southern ambitions. Winter brought opportunities for Catherine to focus on the legal and administrative frameworks needed to govern her diverse new subjects effectively. Her morning routine expanded to include consultations with Islamic scholars who could advise on incorporating Muslim legal traditions into Russian administrative systems. These discussions required delicate balancing of religious autonomy with imperial authority, as Catherine sought to avoid the religious conflicts that had plagued other multi-ethnic empires throughout history. The question of serfdom in newly conquered territories presented particularly complex challenges as Catherine worked to extend Russian agricultural systems while accommodating existing land tenure arrangements. Her afternoon meetings with agricultural experts revealed the enormous differences between Russian farming methods and the pastoral traditions of Crimean Tatars. Converting nomadic herders into settled farmers would take generations, requiring patient investment in education and infrastructure that tested even Catherine's long-term vision. Diplomatic correspondence during this period reflected the international attention that Russia's expansion had generated among European powers concerned about shifting balances of influence. Catherine's evening hours were often consumed with drafting responses to foreign inquiries about her intentions regarding further expansion. Her words carefully chosen to provide reassurance while maintaining strategic ambiguity about future objectives. The art of diplomatic communication had become more crucial than ever as Russia's growing power attracted both admiration and suspicion from neighbors who had previously dismissed the empire as a peripheral concern. The development of Sevastopol as Russia's primary Black Sea naval base required Catherine to master technical details of harbor construction and fleet management that had never concerned previous Russian rulers. Her morning briefings from naval commanders included reports on everything from the depth of anchorages to the availability of timber for shipbuilding. She would review these materials while walking through the palace gardens, her mind visualizing the great naval installations that would project Russian power throughout the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean beyond. Educational initiatives in the Southern Territories reflected Catherine's understanding that successful integration required creating loyalty among new subjects rather than merely extracting obedience through force. Her afternoon meetings with educational reformers produced plans for schools that would teach Russian language and culture while respecting local traditions and religious practices. The careful balance required to achieve this integration challenged every assumption about imperial governance that had guided previous Russian expansion efforts. The establishment of major road networks connecting the new territories to St. Petersburg and Moscow marked a crucial milestone in Catherine's integration efforts.
Her evening reviews of transportation reports revealed dramatically reduced travel times that would facilitate both administrative control and commercial development. Merchants who had previously required months to transport goods between southern ports and northern markets could now complete the journey in weeks, opening economic opportunities that would bind the expanded empire together through mutual interest. Religious tolerance emerged as both a practical necessity and a philosophical commitment as Catherine worked to accommodate the diverse faith traditions of her enlarged realm. Her morning meetings with Orthodox bishops and Muslim imams produced agreements on shared governance of mixed communities where different religious groups lived in close proximity. These arrangements required constant adjustment as practical problems arose, but they established principles of mutual respect that would guide Russian religious policy for decades. The establishment of manufacturing centers in conquered territories provided opportunities to implement industrial policies that Catherine had been developing since the early years of her reign. Her afternoon inspections of proposed factory sites revealed her growing understanding of the relationship between industrial development and imperial power. The textile mills and metalworking shops she envisioned would not only serve economic purposes, but would also provide employment for populations that might otherwise remain alienated from Russian rule. Cultural development programs reflected Catherine's belief that lasting imperial integration required more than administrative efficiency or economic opportunity. Her evening meetings with artists and writers produced plans for theaters and libraries that would serve as centers of Russian culture while providing venues for local traditions to flourish alongside imperial institutions. The synthesis she sought would take generations to achieve, but the foundations were being laid through patient investment in cultural infrastructure. Agricultural reform in the southern territories required Catherine to balance productivity improvements with respect for traditional farming methods that had sustained local populations for centuries. Her morning consultations with agricultural specialists revealed the complex relationships between soil types, climate patterns, and farming techniques that determine success or failure in different regions. The experimental farm she established would serve as testing grounds for innovations that might eventually be applied throughout the empire. Urban planning principles developed during this period reflected Catherine's vision of cities that would serve as administrative centers while fostering the commercial and cultural development essential for imperial prosperity. Her afternoon reviews of architectural plans revealed designs that combined practical functionality with aesthetic beauty, creating urban environments that would attract talented individuals while serving the diverse needs of multi-ethnic populations. These planned communities would become showcases for enlightened governance principles. The expansion of Russia's diplomatic network to accommodate new international relationships required Catherine to develop expertise in regions and cultures that had previously been beyond Russian concern. Her evening meetings with diplomatic personnel included briefings on everything from Mediterranean trade patterns to Ottoman court politics that would influence future policy decisions. The intelligence-gathering capabilities she developed during this period would prove essential for maintaining Russia's expanded international position. Military reforms necessitated by the empire's enlarged frontiers challenged traditional approaches to defense that had been adequate when Russia faced threats primarily from northern and western neighbors. Her morning meetings with military planners produced strategies for defending vast southern territories against potential Ottoman counterattacks while maintaining sufficient forces to deter aggression along other borders. The logistical complexities involved in supplying troops across such enormous distances required innovations in military organization that would influence Russian strategic thinking for generations. Commercial development in the Black Sea region opened trading opportunities that had been closed to Russian merchants for centuries. Catherine's afternoon meetings with commercial representatives revealed the enormous potential for grain exports that could finance further imperial development while strengthening Russia's position in European markets. The port facilities under construction would serve not only military purposes, but would also handle the agricultural surpluses that were Russia's greatest natural advantage in international trade. Legal integration of diverse populations required Catherine to develop judicial systems that could accommodate different legal traditions while maintaining imperial unity. Her evening consultations with legal experts produced court structures that would allow local customary law to operate alongside Russian imperial law in matters that did not affect imperial interests. This judicial pluralism represented a sophisticated approach to governing diverse populations that had learned from the mistakes of other multi-ethnic empires. The winter of 1776 brought news that would test Catherine's administrative systems as rebellion erupted in the Ural Mountains under the leadership of Emelian Pugachev, a Cossack who claimed to be the murdered Peter III returned to reclaim his throne. Reports of the uprising reached St. Petersburg through military couriers who rode through blizzards to deliver dispatches describing the spread of revolt among Cossacks, serfs, and ethnic minorities who had grievances against Russian rule. Catherine would receive these reports in her private study each morning, her hands steady as she unfolded documents that revealed the greatest internal threat her reign had yet faced. The Pugachev rebellion forced Catherine to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between enlightened
Governance and imperial stability that had remained theoretical during years of external warfare. Her morning briefings from internal security officials revealed the extent to which rebel propaganda had resonated among populations who felt excluded from the benefits of Russian expansion. The promise of freedom from serfdom and relief from taxation had attracted support from groups that Catherine had hoped to integrate through gradual reform rather than revolutionary change. Military operations against the rebels required Catherine to deploy forces that had been intended for frontier defense against external enemies. Her afternoon meetings with military commanders revealed the difficult choices involved in suppressing internal revolt while maintaining adequate protection against foreign threats. The troops sent against Pugachev were veterans of the Turkish wars, but fighting fellow Russians presented moral challenges that had not existed during campaigns against foreign enemies. Intelligence reports about rebel activities provided Catherine with disturbing insights into the grievances that had made Pugachev's message attractive to significant portions of her population. Her evening reviews of these documents revealed that many rebels were motivated not by simple lawlessness, but by genuine complaints about administrative corruption, excessive taxation, and arbitrary treatment by local officials. Addressing these underlying problems would require reforms more extensive than anything she had previously contemplated. The siege of Orenburg became the focal point of military operations against the rebellion, as government forces worked to relieve the provincial capital that had been under attack for months. Catherine followed the progress of this campaign through daily reports from field commanders, her anxiety growing as she realized that failure to suppress the revolt quickly might encourage similar uprisings throughout the empire. The stakes involved in this internal conflict were higher than any foreign war, as the very survival of her government depended on demonstrating that rebellion would not be tolerated. Propaganda warfare became as important as military operations, as Catherine worked to counter Pugachev's claims to legitimate authority while maintaining popular support for her government. Her morning meetings with court officials produced proclamations that would be distributed throughout affected regions, emphasizing her commitment to addressing legitimate grievances while warning of severe punishment for continued rebellion. The careful balance required in these communications reflected her understanding that suppressing revolt required political as well as military solutions. The capture of Pugachev in September 1774 ended the military phase of the rebellion, but left Catherine facing the complex task of preventing similar uprisings while implementing reforms that would address underlying social problems. Her afternoon meetings with provincial administrators focused on identifying and correcting the administrative failures that had made rebellion possible, while her evening sessions with legal advisors produced new procedures for handling popular complaints before they escalated into violent resistance. The trial and execution of Pugachev provided Catherine with opportunities to demonstrate both imperial justice and imperial mercy, as she balanced the need for punishment with the desire to restore social harmony. Her personal involvement in determining the rebel leader's fate reflected her understanding that this decision would influence popular perceptions of her government for years to come. The public execution in Moscow served as both warning and spectacle, drawing crowds who witnessed the final act of the drama that had threatened to tear the empire apart. Administrative reforms implemented in the aftermath of the rebellion reflected Catherine's determination to prevent future uprisings through improved governance rather than increased repression. Her morning reviews of provincial reports revealed progress in addressing the corruption and inefficiency that had contributed to popular discontent, while her afternoon meetings with newly appointed officials emphasized the importance of fair treatment for all imperial subjects, regardless of social status or ethnic background. The gubernia reform of 1775 represented Catherine's most comprehensive approach to provincial administration, dividing the empire into manageable units that could be governed effectively while maintaining connection to central authority. Her evening studies of administrative theory informed the detailed regulations that would guide provincial governors in everything from tax collection to judicial procedures. The system she created would remain the basis of Russian provincial administration for over a century, demonstrating the lasting value of reforms developed in response to immediate crisis. Economic development programs initiated after the rebellion reflected Catherine's understanding that political stability required providing opportunities for advancement through legitimate channels rather than revolutionary activity. Her morning meetings with commercial advisors produced policies that would encourage trade and manufacturing in regions that had supported the rebellion, while her afternoon sessions with agricultural experts focused on improving farming techniques that would increase rural prosperity. The establishment of new educational institutions throughout the empire represented Catherine's long-term strategy for preventing future rebellions through enlightenment rather than repression. Her evening meetings with educational reformers produced curricula that would prepare future administrators, fostering loyalty to imperial institutions among diverse populations. These schools would serve as centers of Russian culture while respecting local traditions that did not conflict with imperial authority. Social reforms addressing the grievances that had made rebellion attractive required Catherine to balance competing demands from different social groups while maintaining overall imperial stability. Her morning consultations with social theorists produced policies that would gradually improve conditions for serfs and other disadvantaged groups, while avoiding changes so radical that they would provoke counter-revolution among privileged classes. The delicate balance required constant adjustment as she sought to satisfy competing demands without destroying the social foundations of imperial authority. Legal reforms emerging from the rebellion's aftermath reflected Catherine's commitment to ensuring that all imperial subjects had access to justice through legitimate channels rather than violent resistance. Her afternoon meetings with judicial officials produced court procedures that would handle popular complaints efficiently while maintaining appropriate respect for imperial authority. The judicial system she created would serve as a model for other European monarchies seeking to balance popular demands with governmental stability. Military reforms necessitated by the rebellion's lessons emphasized the importance of maintaining internal security while preserving forces adequate for external defense. Her evening meetings with military planners produced organizational changes that would allow rapid response to internal threats while maintaining the professional standards that had made Russian armies successful in foreign campaigns. The balance between internal and external security would remain a constant challenge throughout the remainder of her reign. As 1776 concluded, Catherine could reflect on a year that had tested every aspect of her governmental system, while providing opportunities to implement reforms that would strengthen imperial administration for generations to come. The rebellion had revealed weaknesses in her rule, but her response had demonstrated both the flexibility and determination that would define her approach to governance throughout the remaining decades of her remarkable reign. The lessons learned from Pugachev's rebellion would guide Catherine through the most productive and transformative period of her reign, as she channeled the energy of crisis into comprehensive reform that would reshape Russian society from its very foundations. Her daily routine in the years following 1777 reflected a ruler who had learned to balance visionary ambition with practical necessity, combining the philosophical principles she had studied in her youth with the hard-won wisdom that only experience could provide. Each morning began in her private chambers with a ritual that had become sacred to her approach to governance. Catherine would rise before dawn and spend the first hour of each day reading correspondence from across her vast empire, her fingers tracing the wax seals that bore the marks of distant provinces. These letters brought news of everything from harvest conditions in Ukraine to trading disputes in Siberia, creating a daily portrait of imperial life that informed every decision she would make in the hours ahead. Her secretary would arrange the dispatches in order of urgency, but Catherine insisted on reading them all, understanding that effective rule required intimate knowledge of conditions throughout her realm. The imperial breakfast table had been transformed into a working surface where maps competed for space with legislative drafts and architectural plans. Catherine would examine these documents while consuming her simple meal of black bread and weak tea, her mind already engaged with the complex challenges that each new day presented. The contrast between her modest personal habits and the grandiose projects spread before her reflected the fundamental tension of Enlightened rule, where individual restraint served the cause of imperial magnificence. Her morning audiences had evolved into sophisticated exercises in imperial statecraft, as Catherine received delegations from across Europe and beyond. Foreign ambassadors would present their credentials in ceremonies that combined traditional protocol with substantive discussions of trade agreements and territorial questions. These diplomatic encounters required Catherine to shift seamlessly between languages and cultural expectations, demonstrating the cosmopolitan sophistication that had made Russia a respected member of the European community of nations. The palace corridors buzzed with activity as provincial administrators arrived for their scheduled meetings with the Empress. Catherine had instituted a system of regular consultations that brought governors from distant territories to St. Petersburg for detailed discussions of local conditions and imperial policy. These sessions took place in her private study, where the informal atmosphere encouraged honest reporting about problems that might otherwise be concealed behind bureaucratic euphemisms. Her afternoon hours were devoted to the detailed work of legislation that would transform her philosophical principles into practical policies affecting millions of subjects. Catherine would review proposed laws line by line, her pen making marginal notes that reflected years of study and experience in the art of governance. The legal codes emerging from these sessions would establish principles of judicial fairness and administrative efficiency that represented the most advanced governmental thinking of her era. The Imperial Library remained Catherine's refuge during the intense afternoon hours when the weight of decision-making pressed most heavily upon her shoulders. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, she would consult historical precedents for the challenges she faced, while seeking inspiration from the great thinkers whose ideas had shaped her vision of enlightened rule.
Extensive marginal annotations that revealed her ongoing dialogue with Enlightenment philosophy. Evening brought opportunities for Catherine to engage with the cultural and intellectual life that she considered essential to civilized governance. Her salon gatherings attracted the brightest minds from across Europe, creating an atmosphere where philosophical discussions merged with practical considerations of policy and administration. These conversations often continued past midnight, as Catherine explored ideas that would eventually influence her approach to everything from educational reform to urban planning. The winter months of 1777 brought focus to Catherine's most ambitious domestic project, the comprehensive reform of provincial administration that would extend effective governmental control to every corner of her vast empire. Her morning briefings from administrative experts revealed the enormous scope of this undertaking, which required creating new governmental structures while training thousands of officials in the principles of enlightened administration. The challenge was not merely technical, but philosophical, as she sought to create a system that would serve imperial interests while respecting local traditions and customs. Provincial reform required Catherine to master details of local governance that previous Russian rulers had largely ignored. Her afternoon meetings with regional specialists included discussions of everything from tax collection procedures to judicial organization, each decision carrying implications for the daily lives of millions of subjects. The regulations she approved during these sessions would govern Russian provincial administration for over a century, demonstrating the lasting impact of reforms carefully crafted during this crucial period. The establishment of new towns throughout the empire provided Catherine with opportunities to implement urban planning principles that reflected her vision of rational, efficient governance. Her evening reviews of architectural plans revealed designs for communities that would serve as administrative centers while fostering commercial and cultural development. These planned settlements would become showcases for enlightened governance, attracting visitors from across Europe who sought to understand the principles behind Russia's remarkable transformation. Educational reform emerged as a central priority, as Catherine recognized that lasting change required preparing future generations for the responsibilities of citizenship in an enlightened state. Her morning consultations with pedagogical experts produced curricula that would balance practical skills with moral instruction, creating educational institutions that would serve both imperial needs and individual development. The schools established during this period would become models for educational systems throughout Europe. The founding of the Hermitage as a public institution reflected Catherine's commitment to making high culture accessible to her subjects, rather than reserving it for court entertainment. Her afternoon visits to the growing collection revealed her personal involvement in selecting artworks that would educate as well as inspire, creating a cultural institution that would enhance Russia's international reputation while serving domestic educational purposes. The galleries she designed would welcome visitors from all social classes, democratizing access to artistic treasures that had previously been restricted to royal viewing. Commercial development occupied increasing attention as Catherine worked to harness Russia's natural advantages in ways that would benefit both imperial finances and popular prosperity. Her evening meetings with merchant representatives revealed the enormous potential for expanding trade networks that would connect Russian producers with European markets. The commercial policies she developed during this period would transform Russia from a peripheral supplier of raw materials into a significant participant in international commerce. Agricultural improvements represented perhaps the most challenging aspect of Catherine's domestic reforms, requiring changes in farming methods that had persisted for centuries. Her morning consultations with agricultural specialists included discussions of crop rotation techniques, livestock breeding programs, and land management practices that could increase productivity while improving rural living conditions. The experimental farms she established would serve as laboratories for innovations that might eventually benefit millions of Russian peasants. Legal reform continued to occupy Catherine's attention as she worked to create judicial systems that would provide equal justice while maintaining social stability.
Her afternoon meetings with legal experts produced court procedures that would handle disputes efficiently while protecting the rights of all imperial subjects regardless of social status. The legal principles she established would influence Russian jurisprudence long after her death, creating foundations for a more equitable society. Religious policy required delicate balancing, as Catherine sought to maintain Russian orthodoxy's central role while accommodating the diverse faith traditions of her multi-ethnic empire. Her evening discussions with religious leaders produced frameworks for tolerance that would allow different communities to practice their beliefs while maintaining loyalty to imperial authority. These arrangements would serve as models for governing religiously diverse populations throughout the early modern period. The expansion of Russia's diplomatic presence reflected Catherine's understanding that great power status required active engagement with European political developments. Her morning briefings from foreign ministry officials included intelligence about everything from French revolutionary stirrings to British commercial competition, information that would inform her strategic decisions about alliances and conflicts.
The diplomatic network she built would project Russian influence throughout the civilized world. Cultural patronage became a consuming passion as Catherine worked to establish Russia as a center of European civilization rather than merely a military power. Her afternoon meetings with artists and writers produced commissions for works that would celebrate Russian achievements while contributing to universal human knowledge. The cultural institutions she founded would outlive her political reforms, creating lasting monuments to her vision of enlightened governance. Urban development projects throughout the empire reflected Catherine's belief that proper city planning could foster both economic growth and social harmony. Her evening reviews of municipal plans revealed designs for communities that would combine beauty with functionality, creating urban environments that would attract talented individuals while serving diverse population needs. These planned cities would become symbols of Russian progress and sophistication. Military reform remained essential as Catherine worked to maintain the professional standards that had made Russian armies successful while adapting to changing strategic requirements. Her morning meetings with military commanders produced organizational changes that would improve efficiency while maintaining the discipline and loyalty essential for imperial defense. The military institutions she created would serve Russia faithfully through the challenges of the following century. Industrial development emerged as a new priority, as Catherine recognized the importance of manufacturing capacity for both military strength and economic independence. Her afternoon inspections of proposed factory sites revealed her growing understanding of the relationship between industrial capability and national power. The manufacturing centers she established would provide employment while reducing Russian dependence on foreign suppliers for essential goods. Scientific advancement received increasing support as Catherine understood that technological progress was essential for maintaining competitive advantages in a rapidly changing world. Her evening meetings with scholars and inventors produced policies that would encourage research while ensuring that discoveries served practical purposes. The scientific institutions she founded would contribute to human knowledge while strengthening Russian capabilities in crucial areas. Social reform addressed the fundamental inequalities that had contributed to the recent rebellion while maintaining stability during the transition period. Her morning consultations with social theorists produced gradual changes that would improve conditions for disadvantaged groups without provoking counter-revolution among privileged classes. The social policies she implemented would create more equitable opportunities while preserving the foundations of imperial authority. As 1778 dawned over St. Petersburg, Catherine could survey an empire transformed by systematic reform and enlightened governance. Her daily routine had become a carefully orchestrated symphony of administration that touched every aspect of Russian life, from the grandest questions of international relations to the most intimate details of local governance. The young German princess, who had arrived in Russia over 3 decades earlier, had become the architect of a golden age that would define her nation's character for generations to come. The morning light streaming through the tall windows of her private study illuminated documents that bore witness to achievements that exceeded even her own ambitious expectations.
Trade agreements with European powers lay alongside educational curricula for provincial schools, while architectural plans for new cities shared space with diplomatic correspondence from across the continent. Each paper represented another strand in the complex web of governance that she had woven through decades of patient, methodical work. Her correspondence during this period revealed the international recognition that her achievements had earned for both herself and her empire. Letters arrived regularly from philosophers, monarchs, and statesmen who sought her opinions on questions of governance and policy. Voltaire's communications had evolved from patronizing encouragement to genuine intellectual partnership, while Frederick the Great wrote with the respect due an equal in the art of statecraft. These exchanges placed Catherine at the center of European intellectual life, making Russia a participant in the great conversations that were shaping the modern world. The palace itself had become a symbol of the transformation Catherine had wrought in Russian society. Foreign visitors would marvel at the combination of traditional Russian grandeur with European sophistication that characterized both the architecture and the court culture she had created. The Hermitage galleries attracted scholars and artists from across the continent, while the Imperial Library had become a research center that rivaled the great academic institutions of Western Europe. Her daily walks through the palace gardens provided moments of reflection on the enormous changes that had occurred during her reign. The formal French landscaping represented the ordered rationality she had brought to Russian governance, while the more naturalistic sections reflected her appreciation for the organic development that characterized healthy societies. These quiet interludes allowed her to process the constant stream of decisions and information that defined her role as Empress. The evening entertainments that concluded each day had evolved into sophisticated cultural events that demonstrated Russia's emergence as a center of European civilization. Musical performances featured works by the greatest composers of the age, while theatrical productions showcased both classical dramas and contemporary works that explored themes of governance and social progress. These gatherings served diplomatic and educational purposes, while providing Catherine with the intellectual stimulation that remained essential to her personal well-being. As the 1770s drew to a close, Catherine stood at the pinnacle of her power and influence, having transformed not only her adopted homeland, but also the very conception of what enlightened monarchy could achieve. The daily rhythms of her governance had become the heartbeat of an empire that stretched across 11 time zones, touching the lives of millions of subjects who had benefited from her vision of rational,
compassionate rule. The golden age she had created would endure long after her own remarkable life had ended, a testament to the power of intelligence, determination, and unwavering commitment to the welfare of those she had been called to serve. The transformation of Russia during Catherine's reign extended far beyond the grand proclamations and imperial decrees that filled the official chronicles. It lived in the quiet moments of daily life throughout her vast empire, where her reforms touched the lives of ordinary people in ways both subtle and profound. In the textile workshops of Moscow, master weavers would arrive each morning to find new patterns waiting for approval, designs that reflected Catherine's vision of Russian craftsmanship competing with the finest European productions. The Empress had established guilds with standardized training programs that elevated simple cloth making into an art form worthy of imperial patronage. Workers who had once labored in dim, poorly ventilated chambers now operated in bright, well-organized facilities where safety regulations protected their health while productivity standards ensured their prosperity. The daily routines of these craftsmen began before sunrise as they gathered in workshops that bore little resemblance to the chaotic establishments of previous generations. Catherine's industrial reforms had introduced systematic approaches to manufacturing that increased both quality and quantity while improving working conditions. Master craftsmen would begin each day by inspecting raw materials delivered according to new supply contracts that guaranteed consistent availability of the finest wool and silk. Their apprentices learned not merely traditional techniques, but innovative methods developed through correspondence with European manufacturers who shared knowledge freely with Russian counterparts. Provincial schools established throughout the empire opened their doors each morning to students who represented the first generation of Russians to receive systematic education, regardless of their social origins. Catherine's educational reforms had created curricula that balanced practical skills with moral instruction, preparing young people for productive roles in an increasingly sophisticated society. Village teachers would begin their daily lessons with reading exercises that used texts celebrating Russian achievements alongside classical works that connected their students to the broader stream of human knowledge. The school buildings themselves reflected Catherine's attention to the details that shaped daily experience. Classrooms were designed with large windows that provided natural light throughout the day, while heating systems ensured comfortable learning environments during the harsh winter months. Students would gather each morning around tables crafted by local artisans according to specifications that promoted good posture and focused attention. Their textbooks, printed on presses established through imperial investment, contained illustrations and maps that made abstract concepts tangible and memorable. Agricultural communities throughout the empire experienced the rhythms of farm life transformed by innovations that Catherine had encouraged through model estates and experimental programs. Farmers would begin their morning rounds of livestock that had been improved through selective breeding programs, while their fields displayed the results of crop rotation techniques that increased yields while preserving soil fertility. The traditional wooden plows had been gradually replaced by iron implements that turned furrows more efficiently, reducing the physical strain of farm work while increasing productivity. Village granaries built according to new designs protected harvested grain from moisture and pests, ensuring food security through winter months that had previously brought hunger to many rural communities. The morning inspection of these facilities became a ritual that connected farmers to the larger imperial economy, as they understood that their surplus production would feed growing cities while generating income for local improvements. Market towns throughout the empire bustled with commercial activity that reflected Catherine's policies promoting trade and manufacturing. Merchants would arrive at dawn to arrange their goods according to regulations that ensured fair dealing while protecting consumer interests. The standardized weights and measures that Catherine had mandated eliminated the confusion and cheating that had previously plagued commercial transactions, creating trust between buyers and sellers that encouraged expanded trade. The market squares themselves had been redesigned according to principles that promoted both efficiency and civic pride. Covered stalls protected merchants and customers from weather while providing organized spaces for different categories of goods. Public scales, available for independent verification of purchases, demonstrated the imperial commitment to honest dealing, while posted price lists prevented exploitation of customers unfamiliar with market conditions. Transportation networks connecting these communities had been transformed through road-building projects that reduced travel times while increasing safety for merchants and ordinary travelers. Mail coaches now operated on regular schedules that connected distant provinces to the capital, carrying not only official correspondence, but private letters that bound families and communities together across vast distances. The drivers of these vehicles began each day by inspecting horses that were maintained according to standards that ensured reliable service, while way stations provided fresh animals and comfortable accommodations for passengers. Urban life in major cities reflected Catherine's vision of communities that would serve as centers of culture and commerce, while providing healthy environments for diverse populations. Morning routines in St. Petersburg and Moscow began earlier as expanded commercial activity created new opportunities for employment and advancement. Artisans would open workshops that produced goods according to quality standards that earned respect in European markets, while their apprentices learned not only traditional techniques, but innovative methods developed through correspondence with European manufacturers who shared knowledge freely with Russian counterparts.
Learned trades that provided secure livelihoods and social mobility. The city streets themselves had been improved through paving projects and drainage systems that eliminated the mud and standing water that had previously made urban life unpleasant and unhealthy. Street lighting allowed evening activities to continue safely after dark, while regular refuge collection maintained sanitary conditions that reduced disease and improved quality of life. Citizens would begin their daily activities in environments that reflected imperial investment in public welfare rather than merely ceremonial display. Hospitals and medical facilities established throughout the empire opened each morning to serve patients who received care according to the latest European medical knowledge. Catherine's health reforms had introduced training programs for physicians and surgeons that elevated Russian medical practice to international standards. Morning rounds by trained doctors replaced the folk remedies and superstitious treatments that had previously characterized medical care, while systematic record-keeping allowed tracking of disease patterns and treatment effectiveness. The daily operations of these medical institutions reflected Catherine's understanding that public health was essential for imperial prosperity. Pharmacies stocked medicines prepared according to standardized formulations, while surgical instruments were maintained to specifications that reduced infection and improved outcomes. Nurses, trained in proper procedures, provided care that combined professional competence with compassionate attention to patient needs. Religious institutions continued their traditional roles while adapting to Catherine's policies, promoting tolerance and education. Morning prayers in Orthodox churches were supplemented by educational programs that taught literacy alongside spiritual instruction. Priests who had received expanded training served communities more effectively while maintaining the spiritual traditions that bound Russian society together. The church buildings themselves reflected imperial investment in institutions that served both spiritual and social functions within their communities. Monastery schools opened their doors to students from diverse backgrounds, providing educational opportunities that had previously been restricted to the wealthy elite. The daily routines of these institutions combined religious observance with academic instruction that prepared students for useful roles in civil society. Libraries attached to religious foundations made books available to scholars and curious citizens who sought knowledge beyond their immediate practical needs. Legal institutions established throughout the empire began each day with court sessions that provided accessible justice according to standardized procedures. Catherine's judicial reforms had created courts that handled disputes efficiently while protecting the rights of all participants, regardless of social status. Judges trained in legal principles rather than local customs applied laws consistently, while court clerks maintained records that allowed appeals and review of disputed decisions. Courthouse buildings constructed during this period reflected Catherine's vision of institutions that would inspire respect for law while providing practical facilities for legal proceedings. Courtrooms designed with proper acoustics ensured that all participants could hear testimony clearly, while separate spaces for different types of cases allowed efficient handling of the growing volume of legal business. Citizens would arrive each morning confident that their disputes would receive fair consideration according to known principles rather than arbitrary decisions. Prison facilities operated according to humanitarian principles that emphasized rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. Daily routines for inmates included productive work that taught useful skills while contributing to institutional maintenance. The reform programs Catherine had implemented recognized that most criminals could become productive citizens if provided with proper guidance and opportunities for improvement. Military installations throughout the empire maintained the professional standards that had made Russian armies successful while adapting to peacetime responsibilities that included public works and emergency response. Morning drills prepared soldiers for combat, while training exercises developed skills useful for civilian projects. The barracks and training facilities reflected imperial investment in maintaining military readiness while providing soldiers with living conditions that honored their service to the state. Officers trained in military academies established during Catherine's reign brought professional competence to their commands while understanding their responsibilities to the civilian populations they served. Their daily routines included administrative duties that connected military installations to the broader imperial governance system, ensuring that armed forces served national interests rather than narrow military concerns. Economic development throughout the empire reflected Catherine's policies, encouraging innovation and competition while protecting established communities from disruption. New manufacturing centers began operations each morning with workers who had been trained in modern techniques while respecting traditional skills that remained valuable. The industrial facilities constructed during this period combined efficiency with attention to worker welfare, creating employment opportunities that improved living standards while strengthening the imperial economy. Banking institutions established in major commercial centers opened their doors each morning to serve customers who could obtain credit for business expansion while saving earnings that earned interest over time. The financial services that Catherine had encouraged provided economic stability while facilitating the commercial growth that strengthened communities throughout the empire. Cultural institutions flourishing under imperial patronage enriched daily life for citizens who had previously lacked access to literature, music, and artistic expression. Libraries opened each morning to readers who could explore works by Russian and foreign authors, while theaters presented performances that brought artistic excellence to wider audiences. Many Catherine's daily life improvements reflected her unprecedented commitment to modernizing Russia. Her policies created environments where citizens could pursue better lives with access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities that reflected imperial prosperity.
Entertained while educating audiences about moral and political themes. The cultural development that Catherine had fostered created communities where intellectual curiosity and artistic appreciation became normal parts of daily life. Museums and galleries made art collections accessible to ordinary citizens who could examine works that had previously been restricted to royal viewing. The daily operations of these institutions reflected Catherine's belief that cultural education was essential for creating the enlightened citizenry that would sustain her reforms through future generations. As the 1780s progressed, these transformations in daily life throughout the Russian Empire created a society that bore little resemblance to the one Catherine had inherited decades earlier. The morning routines of millions of subjects reflected the systematic improvements that had touched every aspect of imperial life. From the grandest public institutions to the most intimate family circumstances, the golden age that historians would later celebrate was not merely a matter of court splendor or military victory, but a comprehensive transformation of how ordinary Russians lived, worked, and understood their place in the world. The accumulated effects of these daily improvements created momentum for continued progress that would extend Catherine's influence long beyond her own lifetime. Each morning brought new evidence that enlightened governance could indeed transform society through patient attention to the details that shaped human experience. The empire that Catherine had built through decades of systematic reform would stand as a testament to the power of intelligent, compassionate leadership to create lasting change in the lives of millions of people who had never seen their Empress, but who benefited daily from her vision of what Russia could become. The dawn of 1785 found Catherine in her private chambers, her weathered hands tracing routes across maps that showed an empire stretching from the Baltic shores to the Pacific coastline. Her morning tea had grown cold as she absorbed reports from governors whose territories encompassed lands larger than most European kingdoms. Each dispatch revealed the continuing transformation of Russian society, as communities from the Arctic tundra to the Crimean steppes adapted to reforms that touched every corner of daily existence. Her correspondence during these mature years of her reign revealed a ruler who had learned to see beyond the grand gestures of statecraft to the quiet revolutions occurring in countless villages and towns. Letters from provincial administrators described changes that might seem mundane to outside observers, but represented fundamental shifts in how Russians understood their relationship to authority, education, and opportunity. A village priest wrote of peasant children learning to read using books printed in Russian rather than Church Slavonic. A merchant from Kazan described new trading relationships that connected his modest enterprise to markets in Amsterdam and London. The palace routine had evolved to accommodate Catherine's expanding vision of what governance required in an enlightened age. Her morning audiences now included delegations from learned societies, scientific academies, and cultural institutions that had flourished under her patronage. These meetings took place in chambers lined with portraits of philosophers and scientists whose ideas had influenced her policies, creating an atmosphere where intellectual achievement received the same respect traditionally reserved for military valor or noble birth. Agricultural reports arriving throughout the winter months painted pictures of rural transformation that extended far beyond increased crop yields or improved livestock. Village communities had begun establishing local schools funded through imperial programs that recognized education as essential for economic development. These institutions operated according to curricula that balanced practical skills with moral instruction, creating generations of Russians who could participate meaningfully in the complex society their Empress was creating. The daily operations of these rural schools reflected Catherine's understanding that lasting change required patient investment in human development. Teachers trained in pedagogical institutes would arrive each morning to classrooms equipped with maps, books, and writing materials that connected remote communities to the broader world of learning. Students who had never traveled beyond their village boundaries could trace trade routes across continents while learning arithmetic skills that would serve them whether they remained farmers or sought opportunities in expanding commercial centers. Manufacturing communities throughout the empire demonstrated the practical effects of Catherine's industrial policies, as workshops and factories began each day with operations that combined traditional Russian craftsmanship with innovative techniques learned from European correspondents. Master artisans who had once guarded trade secrets now taught apprentices according to standardized programs that elevated entire industries while maintaining quality standards that earned respect in international markets. The textile centers of Moscow had become showcases for Russian manufacturing capability, as workshops produced fabrics that competed successfully with products from established European producers. Workers would gather each morning in facilities designed according to principles that balanced productivity with attention to human welfare, creating employment opportunities that provided both economic security and personal dignity. The guild systems that Catherine had reformed ensured that skilled craftsmen received fair compensation while maintaining the quality standards that made Russian goods desirable throughout Europe. Commercial life in major cities reflected the growing sophistication of Russian economic activity, as merchants and traders began their daily routines in markets that operated according to regulations promoting fair dealing while encouraging innovation and competition. The standardized weights and measures that Catherine had mandated throughout the empire eliminated confusion
while building trust between buyers and sellers from different regions and cultural backgrounds.
Banking institutions established during her reign opened their doors each morning to serve customers who could obtain credit for business expansion while earning interest on savings that accumulated over time. These financial services provided stability for family enterprises while facilitating the commercial growth that strengthened communities throughout the imperial territories. Provincial merchants who had once struggled to obtain capital for expansion could now access loans secured by their demonstrated competence rather than family connections. Transportation networks connecting distant provinces had revolutionized the daily experience of traveling communication throughout the empire. Mail coaches operated on schedules that connected remote settlements to major cities, carrying correspondence that bound families together across vast distances, while facilitating commercial relationships that would have been impossible under previous conditions. The roads themselves had been improved through engineering projects that reduced travel times while increasing safety for merchants and ordinary citizens. Urban planning initiatives in cities throughout the empire reflected Catherine's vision of communities that would serve as centers of culture and commerce while providing healthy environments for diverse populations. Morning routines in these planned settlements began with activities that would have been impossible in the chaotic urban environments of previous generations. Streets paved according to systematic designs eliminated the mud and debris that had previously made city life unpleasant, while drainage systems prevented the standing water that had contributed to disease and discomfort. Public facilities constructed during this period demonstrated imperial commitment to citizen welfare that extended beyond the traditional concerns of taxation and military service. Public baths operated according to sanitary standards that promoted health while providing affordable services to working families. Market halls protected merchants and customers from weather while organizing commercial activity according to principles that encouraged fair dealing and prevented fraud. Medical institutions throughout the empire began each day with services that reflected the latest European knowledge about disease prevention and treatment. Hospitals established through Catherine's health initiatives provided care according to professional standards while training physicians and surgeons whose skills elevated Russian medical practice to international levels. The systematic record-keeping that these institutions maintained allowed tracking of disease patterns while improving treatment protocols through careful observation and documentation. Pharmacies stocked medicines prepared according to standardized formulations that ensured consistent quality, while reducing the dangerous variations that had previously characterized medical treatments. Citizens could obtain remedies that had been tested for safety and effectiveness rather than relying on folk preparations whose ingredients and potency varied unpredictably. Religious institutions continued their traditional roles while adapting to policies that promoted tolerance and education alongside spiritual instruction. Orthodox churches opened their doors each morning to congregations that included believers from diverse social backgrounds, while monastery schools provided educational opportunities that had previously been restricted to wealthy families. The theological seminaries that Catherine had reformed produced clergy who combined spiritual devotion with intellectual sophistication, creating religious leadership capable of guiding communities through the challenges of social transformation. Islamic communities in conquered territories practiced their faith according to arrangements that respected religious traditions while maintaining loyalty to imperial authority. Mosques and madrasas operated according to agreements that allowed traditional Islamic education, while ensuring that Muslim subjects understood their rights and responsibilities as Russian citizens. The careful balance that Catherine had achieved in religious policy created stability while demonstrating that imperial unity could accommodate religious diversity. Legal institutions established throughout the empire provided accessible justice according to procedures that protected the rights of all participants, regardless of social status or ethnic background. Morning court sessions handled disputes efficiently, while maintaining standards of evidence and procedure that ensured fair outcomes. The judges who presided over these proceedings had received training in legal principles rather than merely inheriting positions through family connections, creating judicial systems that commanded respect through competence rather than tradition alone.
Prison facilities operated according to humanitarian principles that emphasized rehabilitation while protecting society from dangerous criminals. Daily routines for inmates included productive work that taught useful skills while contributing to institutional maintenance and community welfare. The reform programs that Catherine had implemented recognized that most lawbreakers could become productive citizens if provided with proper guidance and opportunities for legitimate advancement. Military installations throughout the empire maintained the professional standards that had made Russian armies successful, while adapting to peacetime responsibilities that included public works and emergency response. Morning drills prepared soldiers for combat, while training exercises developed skills useful for civilian projects such as road construction and disaster relief. The military academies that Catherine had established produced officers who combined professional competence with understanding of their responsibilities to the civilian populations they served. Economic development throughout the empire reflected policies that encouraged innovation and competition while protecting established communities from disruption. New manufacturing centers began operations with workers trained in modern techniques while respecting traditional skills that remained valuable. The industrial facilities constructed during this period combined efficiency with attention to worker welfare, creating employment opportunities that improved living standards while strengthening the imperial economy.
Cultural institutions flourishing under imperial patronage enriched daily life for citizens who had previously lacked access to literature, music, and artistic expression. Libraries opened their doors each morning to readers who could explore works by Russian and foreign authors, while theaters presented performances that entertained audiences while exploring themes of moral and political significance. The cultural development that Catherine had fostered created communities where intellectual curiosity and artistic appreciation became normal parts of daily experience. The Academy of Sciences, established in St. Petersburg, attracted scholars from across Europe while training Russian researchers who contributed to advancing human knowledge in fields ranging from mathematics to natural history. Daily lectures and research activities created an intellectual environment that rivaled the great universities of Western Europe while addressing questions particularly relevant to Russian conditions and opportunities. Museums and galleries made art collections accessible to ordinary citizens who could examine works that had previously been restricted to royal viewing. The Hermitage had evolved from a private imperial collection into a public institution that welcomed visitors from all social backgrounds, demonstrating Catherine's belief that cultural education was essential for creating the enlightened citizenry that would sustain her reforms through future generations. Provincial theaters, established throughout the empire, presented works that combined entertainment with moral instruction, creating cultural experiences that elevated public taste while reinforcing social values that supported imperial unity. Acting companies trained according to European standards brought professional quality to performances that might once have been amateur entertainments, while playwrights developed works that addressed specifically Russian themes and concerns. Scientific expeditions funded through imperial patronage explored territories from Siberia to the Caucasus, documenting natural resources while mapping regions that had previously been unknown to systematic investigation. The knowledge gathered through these expeditions informed policies regarding settlement patterns, resource exploitation, and environmental protection that would influence imperial development for generations. Agricultural experiment stations established throughout the empire tested new crops and farming techniques while demonstrating improved methods to local farming communities. The daily operations of these facilities combined scientific investigation with practical education, creating resources that helped farmers increase productivity while adapting to changing market conditions and climate variations. Veterinary services developed during Catherine's reign protected livestock health while reducing losses that had previously devastated rural communities.
The trained animal doctors who served provincial areas brought scientific knowledge to problems that had once been addressed through superstition and guesswork, creating more reliable agricultural production while improving rural prosperity. Weather observation networks established throughout the empire collected data that improved understanding of climate patterns while providing practical information for farmers, merchants, and travelers. The systematic record-keeping that these stations maintained created databases that would prove invaluable for future scientific research while serving immediate practical purposes. Mining operations in Siberia and the Urals operated according to techniques that improved both productivity and worker safety while reducing environmental damage. The engineering expertise that Catherine had encouraged through educational programs and foreign consultation created extractive industries that could compete internationally while providing employment for growing populations in previously underdeveloped regions. As the 1780s progressed toward their conclusion, the accumulated effects of these systematic improvements had created a Russian empire that bore little resemblance to the realm Catherine had inherited 4 decades earlier. The daily routines of millions of subjects reflected transformations that touched every aspect of imperial life. From the grandest public institutions to the most intimate family circumstances, citizens awoke each morning to opportunities and securities that their grandparents could never have imagined, while understanding themselves to be participants in a great experiment in enlightened governance that had captured the attention of the civilized world. The Golden Age that historians would later celebrate was not merely a matter of court splendor or military conquest, but a comprehensive transformation of how ordinary Russians lived, worked, and understood their place in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. The empire that Catherine had built through decades of patient reform stood as testament to the power of intelligent, systematic leadership to create lasting change in the lives of people who might never see their Empress, but who benefited daily from her vision of what Russia could become. The morning light that streamed through the windows of the Winter Palace each day illuminated documents and maps that bore witness to achievements exceeding even Catherine's own ambitious expectations when she had first assumed power. Trade agreements connected Russian merchants to markets across Europe and Asia, while educational reports described literacy rates rising throughout provinces that had once known only oral traditions. Scientific correspondence brought news of discoveries that added to human knowledge while serving practical imperial purposes. Her personal routine during these mature years reflected a ruler who had learned to balance the grand responsibilities of empire with attention to details that shaped individual lives throughout her vast realm. The woman who had begun her journey as an uncertain German princess had become the architect of transformations that would influence Russian society long after her own remarkable life had ended, creating institutions and traditions that would guide her people through challenges she could not foresee, while preserving the essential spirit of enlightened governance that had made such achievements possible. The correspondence that arrived each morning at the Winter Palace during the final decade of Catherine's reign carried news that would have seemed impossible to the young German princess who had first stepped onto Russian soil half a century earlier.
Letters bearing the seals of provincial governors described universities rising in cities that had barely existed when she took the throne, while reports from distant trading posts spoke of Russian merchants conducting business in languages she herself was still learning to read. Her morning ritual had evolved into something resembling a quiet symphony of imperial administration. Catherine would wake before the first bells of St. Petersburg's churches began their dawn chorus, her hands already reaching for the leather dispatch cases that her secretaries arranged beside her bed each night. The candlelight would flicker across documents written in scripts that represented the vast diversity of her subjects, from the flowing Arabic of Tatar administrators to the precise German of Baltic merchants who had thrown their fortunes behind Russian expansion. The palace kitchens would deliver her simple breakfast of black bread and weak tea to whatever room she had chosen as her morning workspace. For Catherine had learned that the business of governing an empire could not be confined to formal chambers and scheduled audiences. She might review agricultural reports while walking through the Hermitage galleries, her footsteps echoing among masterpieces she had collected from across Europe, or study military dispatches while seated in gardens where the morning frost created crystalline patterns on leaves that would melt before the sun climbed high enough to warm the palace walls. The morning audiences that followed had become legendary among foreign visitors for their accessibility and substance. Catherine would receive petitioners in chambers where portraits of Voltaire and Diderot looked down upon conversations that ranged from the practical concerns of village blacksmiths to the theoretical questions posed by professors from the expanding network of imperial academies. A Siberian fur trader might find himself waiting alongside a French philosopher, while Orthodox priests shared benches with Muslim scholars who had traveled from the Crimea to discuss points of religious law that affected their communities. Her afternoon sessions had developed into intensive workshops, where the detailed business of transformation took place through countless small decisions that accumulated into sweeping change. Catherine would spread architectural plans across tables that had once held only military maps, her finger tracing the layouts of hospitals that would serve communities where disease had once claimed lives with seasonal regularity. The margins of these documents bore her handwritten notes about ventilation systems and drainage considerations that reflected years of studying medical treatises and consulting with European experts about public health. The schools that opened their doors each morning throughout the empire carried forward educational experiments that Catherine had been refining for decades. Village teachers would begin their daily lessons with reading exercises that used stories celebrating Russian achievements alongside classical texts that connected their students to the broader currents of human learning. Children who had never seen a book before Catherine's reforms now competed to demonstrate their mastery of arithmetic problems that would prepare them for roles in an increasingly commercial society. The workshops and manufactories that began operations each dawn throughout Russian cities reflected industrial policies that balanced innovation with respect for traditional craftsmanship. Master artisans would arrive at facilities designed according to principles that prioritized both productivity and worker welfare. Finding raw materials arranged according to supply systems that ensured consistent quality while supporting communities of producers scattered across the empire's vast territories. Catherine's evening receptions had evolved into sophisticated cultural events where intellectual discourse merged with practical considerations of governance and policy. Foreign diplomats would find themselves engaged in conversations about agricultural techniques with provincial governors, while visiting scholars debated points of natural philosophy with military engineers whose practical experience informed theoretical discussions. The Empress herself moved through these gatherings with an ease that came from decades of practice, her questions revealing deep knowledge of subjects that ranged from crop rotation methods to the latest developments in European manufacturing. The Empress's library remained her sanctuary during the quiet hours when the weight of decision pressed most heavily upon her shoulders. Here, surrounded by volumes that chronicled the rise and fall of empires throughout history, Catherine would spend late evening hours studying precedents for the challenges she faced while seeking inspiration from thinkers whose ideas continued to shape her approach to governance. Her personal copies of philosophical works bore extensive marginal annotations that revealed an ongoing dialogue with Enlightenment principles as she tested abstract theories against the practical realities of governing millions of subjects across 11 time zones. The correspondence that flowed from her private study during these evening hours connected Catherine to intellectual networks that spanned the civilized world. Letters to European philosophers explored questions of justice and governance, while communications with provincial administrators addressed the practical details of implementing reforms in communities that varied enormously in their customs, languages, and economic foundations. Each exchange contributed to a comprehensive vision of modernization that respected local traditions while advancing universal principles of human progress.
Dignity and opportunity. The winter months brought opportunities for Catherine to focus on the long-term projects that would define her legacy for future generations. Her morning meetings with architectural consultants produced plans for cities that would serve as regional capitals throughout the expanded empire, their designs reflecting principles that balanced administrative efficiency with cultural identity. The afternoon sessions with educational reformers generated curricula that would prepare Russian students to participate in international scholarly communities while maintaining their connections to the spiritual and cultural traditions that bound their society together. The hospitals and medical facilities that opened their doors each morning throughout the empire provided services that reflected the latest European knowledge about disease prevention and treatment. Physicians trained in programs that Catherine had established would begin their daily rounds with patients who received care according to professional standards that had elevated Russian medical practice to international levels. The systematic approach to public health that she had implemented created communities where epidemic diseases that had once devastated populations became manageable challenges addressed through coordinated responses. Religious institutions continued their traditional roles while adapting to policies that promoted tolerance and education alongside spiritual instruction. Orthodox monasteries opened their libraries each morning to scholars who could access manuscripts and texts that contributed to both religious understanding and secular learning. The theological schools that Catherine had reformed produced clergy who combined spiritual devotion with intellectual sophistication, creating religious leadership capable of guiding communities through the challenges of rapid social transformation. The legal institutions that began their daily sessions throughout the empire provided accessible justice according to procedures that protected the rights of all participants regardless of social status or ethnic background. Courts operated according to standardized procedures, while judges trained in legal principles rather than local customs applied laws consistently across territories that encompassed dozens of different cultural traditions. The judicial reforms that Catherine had implemented created systems that commanded respect through competence and fairness rather than arbitrary authority. Commercial activity in markets throughout the empire reflected policies that encouraged innovation and fair dealing while protecting consumers from fraud and exploitation. Merchants would arrive each morning to trading centers that operated according to regulations promoting honest transactions while facilitating the expanded commerce that connected Russian producers to international markets. The standardized weights and measures that Catherine had mandated eliminated confusion while building trust between participants from different regions and cultural backgrounds. Military installations throughout the empire maintained the professional standards that had made Russian armies successful while adapting to peacetime responsibilities that included public works and emergency response. Training exercises prepared soldiers for combat while developing skills useful for civilian projects such as road construction and disaster relief. The military academies that Catherine had established produced officers who understood their responsibilities to the civilian populations they served while maintaining the disciplined competence that had earned international respect for Russian armed forces. The cultural institutions that flourished under imperial patronage enriched daily life for citizens who had previously lacked access to literature, music, and artistic expression. Theaters presented performances that combined entertainment with moral instruction, while libraries made books available to readers from all social backgrounds. The Academy of Sciences attracted scholars from across Europe, while training Russian researchers who contributed to advancing human knowledge in fields that ranged from mathematics to natural history. Scientific expeditions funded through imperial resources continued exploring territories from Siberia to the Caucasus, documenting natural resources while mapping regions that had previously been unknown to systematic investigation. The knowledge gathered through these efforts informed policies regarding settlement patterns and resource development while contributing to the broader human understanding of natural phenomena and geographical relationships.
Agricultural experimentation stations throughout the empire tested new crops and farming techniques while demonstrating improved methods to local communities. The daily operations of these facilities combined scientific investigation with practical education, creating resources that helped farmers increase productivity while adapting to changing market conditions and environmental variations.
As the 1790s approached, Catherine could observe from her morning windows an empire that bore witness to the power of systematic, enlightened governance to transform human societies. The daily routines of millions of subjects reflected improvements that touched every aspect of imperial life, from the grandest public institutions to the most intimate family circumstances. Citizens throughout her vast realm awakened each morning to opportunities and securities that their ancestors could never have imagined, while understanding themselves to be participants in a great experiment that had captured the attention and admiration of the civilized world. The golden threads of prosperity, education, and cultural development that she had woven through decades of patient work created a tapestry of achievement that would endure long after her own remarkable journey had reached its conclusion. The morning light that illuminated the Winter Palace each day revealed documents and maps bearing witness to transformations that exceeded even her own ambitious expectations, while the evening shadows that fell across her private study reminded her that the work of building a just and prosperous society required constant vigilance and unwavering commitment to the welfare of those she had been called to serve. In the quiet moments between the urgent demands of imperial administration, Catherine could reflect upon a life that had transformed not only herself from uncertain princess to confident empress, but an entire civilization, from medieval obscurity to enlightened prominence among the great powers of Europe. The daily rhythms of governance that she had established would continue to guide Russia through challenges she could not foresee, while the institutions she had created would preserve the essential spirit of rational, compassionate leadership that had made such extraordinary achievements possible. The woman who had once wondered if she would ever truly belong in the land of her adoption had become its greatest architect, creating foundations that would support Russian greatness for generations to come, while demonstrating to the world that enlightened principles could indeed govern vast empires, populated by diverse peoples united in their desire for justice, prosperity, and the opportunity to develop their full human potential under wise and benevolent rule. And so, our peaceful journey through the corridors of time draws to its gentle close as the candles burn low in the Winter Palace and Catherine's extraordinary story finds its rest. We have walked alongside a remarkable woman who arrived as a teenage stranger in a foreign land and transformed herself into the architect of an empire's golden age. Through these quiet hours together, we have witnessed the daily rhythms that shape not just an empress, but an entire civilization. From those early morning language lessons where Sophie struggled with Cyrillic letters, to the final years when Catherine's correspondence reached every corner of the known world, we have seen how patient determination and enlightened vision can reshape the very fabric of human society. The schools that opened their doors each morning, the workshops where craftsmen perfected their trades, the courts that dispensed equal justice, the hospitals that healed without regard to social station. All these bore witness to a ruler who understood that true greatness lies not in grand proclamations, but in the countless small improvements that touch individual lives. Catherine's legacy lived not merely in the treaties signed or battles won, but in the village teacher who could read to her students, the merchant
who traded with confidence in fair weights and measures, the farmer whose improved tools made his labor more fruitful. Her golden age was woven from millions of such moments, each one a thread in the great tapestry of human progress. As you drift toward your own peaceful rest tonight, perhaps you'll carry with you this gentle reminder that extraordinary transformation begins with ordinary dedication. One dawn, one decision, one small act of wisdom at a time. Thank you for sharing this tranquil journey through Russia's most remarkable chapter, where an empire was built not through force alone, but through the quiet power of enlightened leadership and unwavering care for those called to serve.